very much for this great input. I think they kind of were very complimentary, and I tried to put them in a nutshell. Branko, you basically said rich people, they have more, they earn more, and they marry among themselves, so they stick together. Which, by the way, I find interesting because it's probably a side effect of emancipation, huh? Because women rise up and I think there's even this phrase of down dating. They don't down date, even less than men.
Less, yeah.
And when I then add what Dennis said, in addition, those rich people, they help each other more. They are able to help each other more. They have more the feeling that they can do things. They have more agency. That's a pretty
gloomy picture.
Gloomy picture, yeah.
Can I just say, yeah, it's a gloomy picture, but obviously there are differences between what a society can do with that and what society cannot do. Society cannot decide who is going to marry whom. So I think it's out of the societal
Fortunately, I'd say.
Decision making, yes. But what society can do, and actually that was I think that why I try to put the focus on that, and that's why the studies like this one about wealth are crucial. At the time where wealth is, and actually it was in the past, when wealth is heavily concentrated, where the labor share is likely to go down, the very nature of things pushes us toward having increasingly unequal incomes. And increasingly unequal incomes then, of course, build the wealth because rich people save. And then you really get into a vicious circle where rising wealth inequality feeds into the increasing income inequality. So this is a basic, I think, story. And it is in order to stop that transmission of such or moving into a vicious circle, that government policy can do certain things, whether it is taxation or whether, what I argue, is spreading out the ownership or some assets, be it financial or others, which then would make the concentration of wealth and capital incomes less. So that's the basic, I think, message here.
I agree with absolutely everything you've said, Branko, except the very beginning, which is, I do think that we can
marriage?
Yes. I do think that we can affect how people value others in a society. That is the job of politics. There are lots of levers there, and we have moved towards a commercialization and financialization of life, where the value of human beings is measured increasingly in terms of the income and wealth that they have. And it need not be so, as you yourself have noted in your book, Capitalism Alone. And I know from my own experience, I refuse to see things that way, and the person I married was one of the highest value individuals I could imagine, a nurse who did enormous amount of good throughout her entire life, in contrast to me, where I'm fighting to be relevant. No, seriously.
You earned probably much more than she did.
And I earned far more than she did. And governments have a large role to play in this. Let's say in many countries, nurses, care workers are paid relatively little, and they say, well, if the market doesn't offer them, the government, public services play a dominant part in this, and it is the government that devalues them, and that leads to a successive multiplier effects in the rest of society. So I think there's a lot that we can do on your point one as well.
Well, it was only, actually, it was not, it was a point, I think, 4, because I really did not want to overemphasize. I might maybe differ from you in that, because I don't think that we can do very much there. I just wanted to say that it leads to reinforcing the other points and leads, of course, consequently to the much easier transmission of wealth across generations and, of course, as we spoke yesterday, to the transmission of advantages that are inbuilt in family and then, of course, carried over, conveyed over to children. So that, of course, becomes much more difficult afterwards to, to readjust.
You see, those two could go on forever, and I have lots of questions, but my job is to get you to ask things. There are questions in the back. Would you have a microphone?
Hello, thank you. I haven't understood what solidarity is in terms of how it's measured. Is it if you're amongst the rich that you lend somebody 10,000 euros until they're back on their feet? If you're in the poorer area, is it donating to food banks? How is it measured? And you'd get a difference anyway between the different levels of society, surely. Can you explain that some more? Thanks.
Okay, I don't want to go into a 1-hour lecture now.
You've written a lot about
how
it.
this is measured, but let me just give 2 examples. There is a difference between outward solidarity and inward solidarity. Inward solidarity is what makes a group cohesive. These are questions that you ask in times of trouble. How many people could you count on to help you out? And their answers to that. Outward solidarity is to what degree are you willing to cooperate with strangers? There, how much money are you willing to give to a stranger is an example of this sort of question. And if you want to pinpoint it in religious terms, it's the difference between loving your neighbor and loving a stranger.
We once had a story where we let people go to houses of rich people to ask for help and to houses of poor people. And I mean, it finally resulted in they got much more help from other poor people. So how does this relate to what you just said?
There is a lot of mythology about this. If you look at in the film Titanic, the people in the bottom level, they're having all the fun. The people up above are absolutely miserable. In Charles Dickens, you have to be poor to be happy, but the data do not in fact show this. The poor are miserable, the poor often lack support. There are often the incidents of broken families, and in the States, the deaths of despair, drug abuse, and so on, concentrated there. And so we need to separate this.
We tend to romanticize poverty, huh?
So long as we are not poor.
Okay. There's a question in the second row.
Thank you. It's also on that issue. How do you measure income in this slice? Is this household income or is it personal income? Because
for me?
No, for him.
For him.
It's also for solidarity and income. How does it connect? Because if you're single, if you're a widow, or you're poor and you don't have solidarity because you don't have a spouse, doesn't it interlink?
Yes, obviously. And who's the agent is critically important. The slides that I briefly showed up there are personal income. Now one can look at household income and you get rather similar results because of your homogamy.
Yeah.
But we can talk later in the break.
Okay. In the back. The lady in the back.
Thank you. I have a question about the demographic transition, which you didn't bring into this at all. For example, what about the rising median age? Like, obviously, when a labor market has a median age of 24 or 26, you're going to have lower income inequality than when the median age is, say, 42 or something in a society, maybe not the labor market. So a rising median age is obviously going to bring greater dispersion of incomes as people's lives progress and so on. So perhaps this increasing longevity is also inducing much greater income inequality. And then same at the tail end with people having fewer children. Obviously then inheritance gets consolidated in fewer and fewer people, so then it becomes even more lumpy. So you have these dual forces, you know, one more direct and one a bit more passive. You didn't bring up the demographic transition. And just one final comment, the Chinese have a phrase that wealth only lasts for 3 generations. And after that, I guess the agency and so on issues are just so endemic that it collapses. It's fubu guo sandai. And I just wonder if you see any signs of that equivalent concept, if you think it holds anywhere in the West, that it doesn't pass 3 generations.
The first question is actually a very difficult one, so I would really skip it because the inclusion of demographics in the normal statistics that we do, the top 1% share, 10% share, Gini, is very difficult and controversial. There were some attempts to do that. They basically floundered. So it is difficult. I understand the logic. You can also work this logic a little bit differently. But the demographics per se are difficult to include, and especially difficult when you come to the comparisons between the countries, because then the assumptions at some point start driving the whole model. And then you really cannot say anymore, is China more unequal than Taiwan, for example, which it is, because you start actually playing with the dynamics and the things get really a little bit out of shape. So I do agree it is an important element, particularly for countries that are aging, but it's not easy to take it into account in the measurement studies.
If I could say just a word about it, you need to look at sort of the entire age distribution. So if everyone were old with a few exceptions, then there would be no big effect on inequality. If everyone were young. So it is the density of the population across the entire spectrum when it shifts, gives rise to the difficulties there. But if I could just say, it's not only China that talked about the 3 generations of wealth. It's usually called the Buddenbrook phenomenon. Yeah, exactly. And there, too, we need to separate myth from reality, because the evidence that it all disappears in 3 generations is extremely thin, to put it very mildly.
What showed the data that we saw in the first presentation, which actually said that the big companies, the big family-owned companies, they survived the First World War. They survived the Second World War.
Actually was a little bit, I have to say, impressive and surprising. I knew that broadly, but of course, it is interesting, let's put it like that. But let me, on the demographic, one more point. It is actually even more straightforward. Look at internationally. What we actually like to study are Nordic countries, because Nordic countries have essentially one member, one household. They are rich, they don't like to live with other people. And that's actually very clear that the richer the country, the smaller is the household size. So it's not only because of lower fertility rates and stuff. People just like to live by themselves. So, because they're rich. And then you look at Mali, which the average size is 9. So when I do these international things, I do it on a per capita basis. And of course, Malian households turn out to be unreasonably poor because, you know, there are certain elements of externality and public goods that we all know exist. But when you divide it by 9, then everybody seems to have a tiny income. I'm not saying that they are rich. I'm just saying that we exaggerate their poverty because of the household size. And this is, of course, a problem in international comparisons, that you have vastly different. So when you work with small households, as I said, Nordics, or for example, Hungary is a very good example. At the lowest level and the highest level, household size is always the same. You know, it's about like 2.1, 2.2. There is no much of a difference.
If I could just say, household size could be considered part of solidarity. There's a very big difference between households that share food among one another and households where the adults beat the children because they're on drugs.
So in a nutshell, being poor in Norway might not be better than being poor in a country where people tend to live in bigger family.
I think that poverty is, statistically, poverty tends to be exaggerated in countries with large household size, unless well, that's another possibility. You make the adjustment and calculate it across equivalent adults, in which case you don't treat each child as a single unit, but you say that actually if you have 9 or 7 children, then actually the units would be like 1/2 of an adult. So then you don't divide the total household income by 9, but divide by, let's suppose, 4.5 or something. But these are really then statistical kind of, artifacts to some extent.
Okay, any other question? There are 2 questions here in the front.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with most what you said, but I found the point with the aging and demographics very important. A related point is just changing education. I mean, at a low development stage, you would have everybody has low qualification, and then as more and more people get high qualification, then there will be a bigger divide, and also within the group of the high skilled, there's just more dispersion. And of course, people have studied all of these things, but I would say it's important to separate them from everything you suggest is now a new development and not just mechanical because of these mechanisms.
I would just say yes, I totally agree. Actually, there is a so-called Kuznets curve of education as well. At a low stage where nobody has any education, everybody is equal. And then you have a small group that becomes educated, so that actually increases inequality. But at the last stage, where actually everybody is educated, the Gini coefficient of education measured by the number of years of study is relatively small. Like in countries like Germany, I would guess it would be probably, the Gini would be probably 0.15, very low, because most people obviously have the compulsory education, plus most of them have some, either 4 years of gymnasium, or they have it like technical school. So the Gini coefficient of education is relatively small.
And what I'd like to add is what type of education becomes really important nowadays. So because of automation and AI and so on, routine jobs are going to be taken over increasingly by machines. And therefore, what human beings will need increasingly in order to compete with the machines is creativity, interpersonal skills, non-routine type activities. And the education that goes for that is very different from the education that is currently delivered, as in the past. I mean, I had to help a long time ago my daughter with her schoolwork in Victorian England. She was looking at education. And their education was primarily about how to make people obedient and clean. And that is a very different concept of education from what we have now. In the future, I'd imagine education will concentrate much more on non-routine creativity, taking responsibility for things, having big interpersonal skills in order to leverage the machines that we're creating.
Is that on? Thank you so much. And I might start with a question that comes from the last thing you just said, which is that we sometimes assume that automation decreases jobs, human jobs, and that's actually not true. So if you think about, say, for instance, tech and AI or machine learning, what happens is labor shifts. So some things may get automated at the front end. It might be easier for some people to do less because of, say, ChatGPT, but the training sets of that sort of machine learning is moved from, say, Western Europe to, say, Nigeria or Kenya, where labor is paid very poorly and in very bad conditions, to clean the data that is then used for a machine learning system or something like ChatGPT, right? So there's something that I would love to learn from both of you around how labor is shifting as tech shifts where data is cleaned. Then the other question I would like to ask is, especially given where we are right now, when you have economies that value, as you said, war, where economies are based on war and militarism, what are the inequalities between, say, economies that are military economies or war-based economies versus potentially economies that are more well-being based? And if there's anything that you've studied that could offer some insight on that.
I don't have much to say on either of these, except that we need to be very, very careful to separate our instinctive prejudices from what the data tells us. And what the data tells us currently concerning your first question is that we simply do not know whether people will be able to leverage these new technologies and thereby gain untold possibilities, or whether they will become, in Harari's terms, the useless class that needs to be pacified through universal basic income, Bürgergeld, which I think which is relevant to what you have done, Branko, because the universal basic income does not automatically increase agency. And active labor market policies, education, training, and so on, do promote agency. And I think we need to be far more sensitive to the instruments that promote agency.
I totally agree on that. Actually, it could be even argued that UBI reduces agency, actually, because of course, there are different views, actually, but it could be that if you have a guaranteed income, I think actually people should and do desire to have an agency where they work and accomplish something. So, but let me just go historically, if I may, very briefly, over your question. So let's go historically how people thought of replacement of labor by machinery. If you look at Adam Smith, he actually thought that division of labor would, of course, increase efficiency and productivity, but would make people stupider, dumber. So it was a negative force for individuals. Actually, in The Wealth of Nations, he contrasts urban worker to peasants and says how much farmers are smarter and more interested in things than workers, which is interesting. Then you look at Marx. Marx thought that technological progress would go to what is called de-skilling. In other words, it would substitute for the jobs that are being currently used and would push people towards jobs that cannot be substituted, but they would be low skill demanding. So actually, you would have a de-skilling of labor force. More recently, there were many papers in the 80s and the 90s written differently that actually when the skill premium went up, the argument was more educated labor is better in working with machines, meaning computers, and consequently it's actually, how should I say, the technological progress is biased toward high-skilled labor. Well, now, I really don't know where we are now currently, because it could be that we just cut off an entire group of jobs that they're entirely taken over by machines. So I really don't know. I can speculate like everybody else. I don't have any inside knowledge on this. But I think that we are really possibly at a different type of technological progress compared to the past. I mean, it's just a possibility. But as I said, maybe it requires much more empirical knowledge and probably thinking as well.
So thank you to both of you. I think we covered a whole lot of issues. Let me ask you one final question concerning the basics of what you were talking about. We actually, your data shows we do have a problem within many societies. And we will talk about solutions more this afternoon in a couple of panels. But when you look towards the kind of solutions economists will have for us, solutions that politicians are thinking about, countries that we should look at, what comes to your mind?
Okay, let me make this is not very original. Obviously, one sort of solution looks at different forms of taxation. I will not going even to enumerate them. You know them well enough. Another sort of solutions, and I tend to prefer that, is so-called pre-redistribution. In other words, making changes before you come to the labor market or to the capital market. And when it comes to capital, I believe, and in Germany is an example, obviously, of co-determination, but that was the agency issue. But in terms of the distribution of capital income, it's really broadening the ownership. I know that there are many problems there. I know that actually even Margaret Thatcher wanted to do that, people's capitalism. It didn't really go very well. But I actually think that if we want to break that chain of which I was speaking before, we really need to make capital more broadly distributed. And on that, let me just my point on the, maybe I'm going to be sort of a devil's advocate here. Obviously, Germany has high wealth inequality. You might remember when ECB report was published, Germans were very surprised to have had to discover to have high inequality and actually relatively low level of wealth. Partly because of the tenancy situation rather than ownership. But that's also a tricky issue because in terms of your welfare, nothing changes de facto if you go from tenancy to ownership. You feel good, I own this apartment, but you own it, I mean, unless you die or move somewhere else or somebody inherits, this ownership simply gives you utility to live in this apartment, which you also have when you're a tenant. So there is a little bit of a fictitious sort of, how should I say, wealth inequality there. So we have just to be aware of that. We cannot do anything because we have to measure things, and if you're a tenant, you're not the owner. But there is a little bit of fictitious stuff there.
Dennis?
You agree?
I agree 100% with everything you've said, and I would just like to add one other thing, which is that governments have at their disposal great levers that affect both agency and solidarity, that give significance to these big inequalities. For example, we can choose whether we create a highly status competitive society or more cooperative one. In the schools, usually children are evaluated in terms of their individual performance, not in terms of their group performance. If you look, there's large literature on the intelligence, collective intelligence of teams, and what it depends on. Does it depend on the average IQ of the team members? Hardly. Does it depend on the highest IQ of that team? Hardly. It depends on completely different things. It depends on things like gender balance, how the conversation flows between different members, your interpersonal abilities. There, a lot of work can be done in education, training, how in enterprises, how that's set up. So using these context-dependent levers is something that we should not ignore. We often pretend as economists that all that is at our disposal are monetary incentives for individuals who are basically self-interested, and that is not the case.
I think Thatcher with her say, oh, there's no such thing like a society has been proven wrong a lot of times. But thanks a lot to both of you. I think this was a lot of food for thought. You earn your coffee break now, but I think they have earned a big applause.